Welcome back, everyone, and I hope everyone online, you've had a chance to grab some food, grab a refreshment and recharge as well. I hope you all got a chance to connect with one another during the break as well, and I'm impressed by the people here in Sydney who made it back inside off the beautiful balcony with the weather that we're having. We are diving right into the next important conversation, which is about how we manage psychosocial risk within our organisations. We're going to have a panel discussion that will explore how organisations are moving beyond regulatory compliance to embed safer, healthier and more supportive cultures. You'll hear perspectives that span law, psychology, corporate practice and frontline realities. So expect to have both some strategic insights shared with you during this next session, as well as some practical takeaways that you can take back to your own workplaces. Guiding our conversation is Moderator Mark Oostergo, who is the Chief Executive and Workplace Psychologist at Australian Psychological Services. Say that 5 times fast. Mark began his career as an Army psychology officer, which includes working with elite special forces. He brings deep expertise in mental health and a wealth of knowledge and understanding of how organisations can create systemic change and also build healthy and successful workplaces. I am going to remind you that the QR code is available. Don't hold your questions to the end. Ask them throughout so that they make sure that they're making their way to the stage. We want to make sure we get to those burning questions. In the meantime, please join me in welcoming Mark to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. It's an absolute privilege to be on stage and moderating the panel this morning around psychosocial risk, so moving beyond compliance and unpacking practically how are we actually doing this within our organisations. I've been working in workplace mental health now for nearly 20 years. I've been working in psychosocial risk for nearly a decade, with my first risk assessment nearly a decade ago. It was a much harder sell back then. It's great to see the regulators on board. We see a lot more activity, which is fantastic. And to unpack what that looks like, I have 3 amazing panellists with me on stage today. Firstly, we have Cilla Robinson, who is a partner at Kingwood Mallesons. She has over 20 years of experience in practicing law across industrial and employment domains, from discrimination and harassment to large-scale litigation. We have Silvey, who's the Executive Manager of Safety and Wellbeing at IAG. Sean has a wealth of experience across a range of different industries, but large, complex organisations in health and safety. He's worked across Bupa, Telstra, ANZ, and is currently leading the health and safety function at IAG. And finally, we have Nicole Boyce, who is the Senior Manager of Health and Safety Governance at Ausgrid. Nicole, again, comes with a range and diverse background in health and safety management across New South Wales Government, across industries like transport and infrastructure. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Amazing. So for our audience members, both live and who are joining us virtually today, yes, we have set questions, but I would really like to open it up to you early. I'm going to be moderating the questions as we go that come from the audience. So please feel free to use the QR code up on the screen. I'll look at them live and we'll definitely be feeding them through to our panel members. Please feel free to ask the hard questions. Let's get into the practicalities of this, because this can be a complex topic. And I think, as we unfold and unpack this together, we have been limited on time because we're running a little bit behind, so it might be a little bit like speed dating. So ask those questions quick and fast. But Cilla, I'm really keen to start off with yourself. You've been in this area for quite some time. I'd be keen to get your reflections around what have you seen change over the last 12, 24, 36 months from a regulatory perspective. Are we still seeing regulators educate, or are we moving more into enforcement?
So look, lots of change. As everybody in the room knows, we've always had obligations at law in terms of psychosocial safety, but there has historically been a focus on physical safety. Thankfully, the regulator has come into the fold in a really significant way. And so I think the main change over the last 12 months or so is the codes of practice that have been introduced in relation to psychosocial hazards, as well as sex-based harassment and sexual harassment. And I think, the codes aren't law themselves, but they are admissible in court in terms of what is reasonably practicable. So I think for organisations, we need to familiarise ourselves with the codes and be ensuring that we're actually discharging obligations consistent with them. In terms of enforcement versus education, absolutely. We are seeing enforcement action all over the place, and it's not just the regulator. We're seeing it in the courts. There's so many headlines with really, really significant penalties. Qantas decision where really organisations are getting hammered if they are not prioritising people over profits. And I think probably the most recent example of that was the prohibition notice that was issued to UTS in the context of a workforce restructure. So that's the first time that that's ever happened, where a restructure was actually put on pause whilst the regulator went in there to ensure that it was unfolding in the way that it should be. And that, interestingly, I don't know if the room is aware, was off the back of an engagement survey that the union had actually done, where staff were reporting back that they were stressed by the process, that consultation hadn't been sufficient. And so education is obviously still there, but enforcement where we can expect significant penalties is well and truly where we are now.
Yeah, so we're absolutely seeing, greater regulation in this space. And I think for me, there's a really great piece in there is this isn't new.
No.
This has actually been around for a long time.
Absolutely.
But we're seeing greater activity.
Yeah.
The UTS case is an interesting one. It'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. There's been a lot of media around it.
Yeah.
In that case, specifically, often we see organisations going through organisational change might look at their enterprise agreement around what consultation looks like.
Yep.
But for our, PCBUs in the room today, what's some added guidance around what that might look like between change consultation from an EA perspective versus a psych risk perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think, there's some people in the room, clients where you have the complexity and the layering of enterprise agreement obligations, award and then safety regulation. And so I think what we're seeing the safety regulator really hone in on is where consultation is being given short shrift. And so what we're looking for is a bespoke assessment ahead of the specific restructure. So are we looking at a particular department? In university sector, are there other hazards in terms of geopolitical scenario, pressures on academics, those kinds of things? And most importantly, some of the concerns that came out of that recent prohibition notice on UTS was this concern that the language in the consultation, notifications was final, that people weren't given enough time, a day's notice where the restructure was in play from the end of last year. And so a lot of these things are motherhood statements, but we do quite often see meaningful consultation, whether it's in the workplace change space or in the safety space, not being given proper focus. And I'm in a dispute at the moment where a union is focusing on that both from a EA breach perspective as well as the safety consequences as well.
Okay, so very much a couple of key takeaways in there. One is ensuring specific risk assessment for the change process and understanding what those risks look like, and also then the quality of consultation that goes with that. Yeah,
and too often we see just a box ticks approach to consultation. I think we are really seeing a change so that won't be tolerated by the regulator, it won't be tolerated by the courts. So having enough time for meaningful consultation, ensuring that you don't have a sequence of other, dates after that, which indicate that we didn't really intend to consult meaningfully. It was a fait accompli. It really is a significant focus of both unions, regulators and courts now. So I think probably that's the biggest takeout in terms of the go forward as well.
Awesome, thanks, Cilla. I think it's a nice segue to you, Sean, around understanding that risk. And, if you think about IAG, quite a large, complex organisation, very different job families, potentially different risk profiles. In your experience, how do you best understand psychosocial risk? What are some of the tools and mechanisms you have at hand?
Look, I think there's a level of accountability that sits with individuals, and I think as Cilla touched on, there's consultation, I guess, in a real authentic way, and it's sort of understanding that your workforce, what are those elements, and there's a technical side to it, I think. You can look at the hazards and go through that whole process and tick them off. That's important, and I think that's good evidence for a regulator to demonstrate rigour in what you've done and a risk assessment and involving the specialists like risk, legal teams in your business. So you've got good infrastructure. That's a good foundation. Then have a real genuine conversation. I think Shelley touched on it earlier around that sort of high trust, high expectations. I think that's important because then if a regulator was to come in, to Cilla's point, you've actually got good evidence of putting this into practice and it actually applies in your workplace, because otherwise you run the risk, and particularly from a safety point of view, it's very academic. I don't understand it. You use words in there and acronyms and I don't get them, and then actually I can't see a connection with my day job, so I'm not going to do anything. And I think that's really important. So there's structure, there's a licence that you've got to have it, and I think now you can get it on your phone rather than pull it out of your wallet. But you need that licence, but you also need the permission to do that with your people. And I think that's the element of trust, and that people within the business that look after the customers trust you to actually let you talk to them, and then they trust you enough that they'll listen, and hopefully then together you can work out what does that look like.
Yeah, so really that strong sense of collaboration in there, and that requirement to have the trust of the business before actually going in to ask some of those questions, and thinking through it from how to actually communicate in a practical way that's going to land with our people.
Yes.
Yep. Fantastic. And I think, often we see organisations tackle this space with a range of different tools. There's multiple different data points, there's surveys, there's, many different ways that we can actually understand the risk profile. How do you, work through that sea of data to kind of understand, given that this isn't linear, it is often multifactorial, how do you unpack that to understand the risk?
Of course, Steve.
Say AI. Go on, do it.
AI and Stephen from Sonder can come in and look at all the data. But, again, there's an element of some really smart people in the organisation that understand data, understand culture, and can interpret that so that I could understand it. But I think it's the sum of information. It's not just one source. The other bit that I think is invaluable, and I'm fortunate enough, with Tara to have an inspirational leader that I think creates an environment which you can challenge yourself in a space that you go, actually, and I think the spirit of this is, how do we make this better? How do we make this a place that people actually really love working here? So I think the fact that if you can have leadership, and I think that's critical, because that brings out the best in you. And Shelley mentioned high expectation. I guess I respect and admire Tara's ability to sort of set the bar higher than probably where I would put it. So that's a motivator. We've got some awesome leaders and what I would call internal customers that I could trust, and they'll tell me if I'm not doing my job properly. That's important, because then you're getting a benchmark that we're actually meeting the needs. And then I think it's important that obviously you've got a reputation within the business, but I think you've got a really good team that trusts you as well, because the team's success reflects on my ability and then our collective ability to do our job. So I think there's data. Learn it, understand it. If you don't understand it, do your homework and ask good questions. And one thing I've always done is, if you go, if I want to talk to Tara and talk about something, or any of the group exec or board, you could answer 3 questions with confidence. And the fourth one, that I'll take that on notice. So, I think also put your hand up, and if you don't know, you don't know, and that's an opportunity. But it is the sum of the parts and the people that you work with that I think is where the opportunities lie, rather than just data.
Yeah. And I think, at the end of the day, we're talking about psychosocial risk. We're talking about the interaction of people with work, and we need to keep the person at the centre of that and understand our people and how the data might explain what might be going on for people. Nicole, I'm going to go to you before I go to a flurry of questions that we're getting from the audience. I guess keen to just understand a little bit, what have you learnt so far around implementing a risk-based approach to psychosocial risk management?
A lot. So I've been responsible for developing a risk management strategy for psychosocial in 2 organisations now. One was a little bit smaller than what we have at Ausgrid. Ausgrid, we've got 3,300 people across a really diverse range of risk profiles in the organisation. The first time that I did it, we dove straight into risk assessment. We used the People at Work tool. We engaged a third party to come in and help us distill the information that we got out of it, and then we tried to work through what some of the controls would be. What I have learnt from that and what we're applying now at Ausgrid is, and this is my words, marinating in that context setting in the first instance. So what is different with Ausgrid is that we're quite a large, very old organisation. We've got really well-established processes from HR and workers' comp and health and safety. All of that exists. What we need to do from a psychosocial perspective is understand what is there already, what is our baseline, and understand the knowledge and the capability of the subject matter experts that we have within the organisation already, bringing them to the table and making sure that we're all aligned in our approach in what we're about to do. And then what I'm really mindful of before we get into the risk assessment phase per se, or risk identification and assessment phase, is being mindful of what risks we might generate throughout the process. So we've got change involved in the project team, we've got health and wellbeing and people and culture, we've got workers' comp, we've got operational representatives from the organisation, and we're all in this context setting space because we know one of the key controls is going to be our leaders across the organisation. And so when we start to overtly talk to the organisation a lot about psychosocial, there's going to be a flurry of, we'll talk to your manager or talk to your people leader. And we want to make sure that they're appropriately equipped to be able to have those conversations without exacerbating more risk. So to me, my biggest learning is spending the time in setting that context. Don't be overwhelmed or afraid by how big it feels, because there are a lot of risk generators and it can feel really overwhelming. Don't be afraid to pare it back and keep it simple and follow that risk management framework quite cleanly and take your time. So long as you are progressing in a considered way, I think that it makes people feel more comfortable with the process, because it can feel quite uncomfortable throughout the entire process.
Absolutely. And I think a couple of key reflections in there is the need for an integrated approach, right? And actually, this is a shared responsibility. It is psychosocial risk is going to go across function, whether that's HR, health and safety, our leaders, our individual workers. So ensuring that we have really clear roles and responsibilities around that is key and critical. And the reflection in there that actually embarking on this journey may actually create a risk. Mm-hmm. So are we managing that risk through risk assessment and control implementation? I've got a question from one of the audience members who sent it through anonymously, but it's a question that I hear quite frequently. So I'm going to throw it to our panel and see who wants to jump in first with it. So the question is, what's your advice to assist or manage people who weaponise psychosocial hazards as a reason for their own poor performance?
The million-dollar question. Look, I think everyone's going to have a different view. I'm obviously coming from the perspective of an employment lawyer. The reality is that lots of people do weaponise it. You can't treat it any differently. The reality is that people might be poor performers. They might be going through, a KPI process. It might be reasonable management action, but they might also be legitimately stressed, or there might be an underlying diagnosis. So I think acceptance that it is a very handy lever that is pulled all the time. I mean, pretty much 100% of the time now, in my experience, or maybe they're just the tricky matters that we get pulled into. But, there's nothing to say in the safety legislation if you think the employee, might be full of BS or telling you porkies, don't do anything. And I think the reality is that most employees will be able to get a medical certificate. It's not our job to undermine that. So I think, practically speaking, trying to separate the streams so that there's the safety stream, the wellbeing stream that somebody's looking after, and then not have the same person looking after the conduct, or performance issues, so that at least they're not inextricably linked. But I think an acknowledgement that work is stressful, cost of living, people are under pressures in their home life as well. So I think you just have to navigate it, take it at face value, and put in the same protections that you would if they weren't going through that process, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on the lens that you put on it.
Okay. Any other comments?
One of the big things that I had a bit of a revelation on recently is that there's a big difference between somebody being psychologically uncomfortable and psychologically unsafe. And so, again, in our project team, we're having these conversations, and particularly with our people and culture team, is that just because somebody is psychologically uncomfortable doesn't mean that they're actually unsafe, and we need to be able to upskill and build that capability and being able to differentiate between the two, supporting the person regardless, but the intervention and the actual then risk exposure is actually quite different.
And I would probably add, I think, building on Nicole's comment, I think there's an element of the definition for leaders, and I think if you, rather than just taking it as a triage of a particular case, the reflections there around how do you empower leaders. So it's one thing to have skills and competencies and capabilities, but I think, Nicole gave a really good example of the confidence. So as a leader of people, I can now interpret what does that mean in terms of how do I behave, how do I manage day to day. I think that's really important, because if anyone who manages anyone can go, I got it, I don't have to buy a couch and be a psychologist and counsel people. I know what my role is. That gives them the confidence. I think then in a disciplined environment, as Cilla mentioned, have a conversation. I mean, there's a difference between being sort of kind and nice in this example. So if leaders have got the confidence to hold people to account, clarity of the role, I think will address sort of long-term issues. Now, there's an art and science to that, so I think the science has got to be good. Then it's the art, because it's applied, and, those environments where you support people to have it and set expectations. I think one of the things that's too easy is to come into an organisation and go, Nicole's my manager, she's got to make me happy.
Yeah.
Right? And if she doesn't, you're not doing your job. So I think there's an element for individual accountability needs to be really clear, because then that avoids, having to call Cilla for a case management, because I am responsible and I hold myself to account. And that's values of an organisation.
And I think that leadership capability piece is the part where we see it fall over most frequently. I mean, people that are in HR, P&C in the room see that. Like, sometimes the leader is actually the hazard. They often, as in a genuine sense. Yeah. Sometimes they're, going through the motions sometimes in a bad way. But I think there's that, we happily, from a society perspective, addressing the historic really bad stigma about mental health and these diagnoses, but it is still, for many leaders, a scary space. And then they think that all they have to do is say, are you okay? Not appreciating that the person will just say yes and then mask everything because they're at work, whereas, you need to have some follow-up questions that they can't just say yes to. So I think we're getting better leadership, but we've still got a long way to go. I think the stoic Aussie, she'll be right, mate, it does still, have a very big place in a lot of workforces. So it's challenging, and I don't think any of us are suggesting that it's easy for leaders, but some of them actually are part of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, my reflections on this is often it's in that inconsistency as well, right?
Totally.
And when I often see one of the key drivers of this kind of experience is someone who's been in role for, 10 years, has been doing what they do, and it's just been written off as that's who they are.
Yeah.
New leader comes in, tries to hold them accountable, and then suddenly it's a psychosocial hazard.
Yeah.
And so that consistency across our leaders is key and critical. And absolutely the recognition that stress is normal. Everyone experiences stress. If we're creating distress, then that's a problem. And, work's work. It's not fun. It's not the weekend. There's going to be parts of my role that I just don't like, and that's okay as long as we're not putting people at risk by doing so, right? I think that's kind of key and critical. So one of the other follow-up questions on this then is the recognition in here that, yes, there's a need for employers to take responsibility to some degree, but have we actually gone too far? Has the pendulum swung the other way and placed too much responsibility on the employer, and our workers aren't taking enough responsibility or accountability for their own well-being? What are your thoughts? Pick a side and debate. No.
Look, I think it probably has gone marginally over to the employer. I think you could look at behaviours that are like, when I come to the workplace, there's almost this parental environment where you've got to look after me. So I think there is a fine line between that accountability, and I think Craig's example, during his career when he felt sort of beaten, metaphorically speaking, and then stood up to it. I think there's a real strong focus on personal accountability, and it's not about you have to be an expert at everything and deal with everything. There's a level of accountability, and then I think it's the organisation provides an infrastructure that helps, but it's an infrastructure for me in my work, in my team as well. I think that's the subtlety of where it will influence people's accountability rather than there's a generic piece. So I do think we're at that cusp of, it's going to navigate somewhere between over here and over there.
I think I'd agree with that, that it's probably slightly tipped closer to more responsibility for the employer, but I think also we need to recognise that there's actually been such a blur between work and home post-pandemic, people working from home and just spending more hours at work. So I think it's much harder to separate work and home life in the way that we historically would have, and the definition of the workplace is expanding. And so I think what people do in their home life does actually quite often impact the workplace, whether they're going out on the weekend and writing themselves off, whatever they might be doing, we might say you should take responsibility. Quite often it bleeds back into the workplace, might impact on other team members and the like. And so I think it is a tricky one that's getting harder. But obviously, employees have obligations under the safety laws as well in terms of their wellbeing. But I think it's a bit of a hard argument to just roll that out to an employee and say, well, you've got obligations too. You're going out and writing yourself off, turning up hungover or whatever on Monday, it's impacting the team. Like, the two get mixed, and then of course it is up to the employer to deal with it because it's impacting on their, wellbeing and quite often others.
Yep. Nicole, any thoughts?
I think that it feels very heavily skewed towards the employer or the PCBU because of all of the noise that we're hearing has been really since the changes in the regs and the code of practice being published. And that is, by nature, very heavily skewed towards PCBU obligations. There is a handful of obligations for workers, but the rest of the Act and the regs are all spelt out about how an employer needs to meet those obligations. So I think that it's understandable why it does feel skewed, and I think that the challenge will be how we actually create the same level of not enforcement, but intention behind what employee responsibility is in there. But to me, the biggest challenge in all of it is giving people the language to be able to have the conversations around it. And so just by way of an example, in one of my previous organisations, I had a worker approach me and say they feel like they're getting bullied by their people leader. And at that point, we developed a tool in and around psychosocial, and I gave it to them and I said, go through this. It went through some of the points of what the psychosocial risk generators were. I said, if you feel comfortable, have a conversation with your people leader. I let the people leader know that they were going to have that conversation. And at the end of it, it was role clarity, lack of manager support that was really contributing to their sense of being bullied. It wasn't bullying at all. And so if you can give people the tools and the language, it's less than about the obligation as such as where it sits. It's about giving people the skills and the knowledge and the capability to be able to come together and do it together.
Yeah. So creating that, creating the capability, competence and confidence to actually be having those conversations between the employer and the worker to actually help identify and manage the risk. And when I think about this, I often conceptualise psychosocial hazards sitting in three buckets, right? So there's going to be your organisation or enterprise-wide hazards. So the way we manage change, enterprise agreements. There's going to be job family hazards, right? I might have greater exposure to violence or vicarious trauma or job demands. And then there's going to be those individual factors that either moderate or exacerbate the risk. And from a PCBU perspective, we can't necessarily control for those individual factors. We can put systems in place for our org and job family factors, but what we can do is respond to those individual factors when we become aware of them or identify them so that we can look at the interaction across those different things. We've spoken, a few of you have spoken the criticality behind leadership, and one of the questions from the audience is, well, how do we actually educate mid-level management who think they can manage psychosocial hazards without WHS intervention or risk assessment, i.e. we've always done or managed this, nothing's changed, why do we actually need to look at this differently? How do you bring those mid-level managers on that journey?
I think we just know more now. And so while we can say, yeah, we've always managed it, we know more about what we're managing. We know more about the ways in which are effective to manage it. So it's less about doing what any safety professionals in the room have heard, this is how we've always done it. It's so much not about having that conversation and driving down the path of continuous improvement, and we're constantly learning and giving people the skills. And it just depends on the motivator of that manager in terms of why they're staying in that space, probably because it's more comfortable for them, rather than anything else. So it's challenging, but they're, as you said before, they're in this awkward position where everybody comes to them, everybody expects middle management to do and be everything. They're the first line of defence. They're on the preventative side, they're on a mitigative side of that bow tie, and so they're actually some of our key people that we need to be working with and on first.
Yeah. I'd probably add, I think there's, as Nicole said, greater awareness of the consequence of not doing it. And we've run an exercise recently that I think probably epitomises the opportunity that we see in front of us is rather than sort of clustering leaders by, do a leadership program and do training, we actually targeted one leader and actually technically probably two. It was quite a structured, close-knit conversation, no slides. Like, it was a conversation.
Yeah.
And it was all about them. It wasn't about us. And it was like real stuff. It was story. So interpreting the law in terms of what does this actually look like. And I reflect on that and think it was like it would have been quicker to organise a wedding than to get two senior people together. But we've seen and experienced the consequence of that. And I think even, one was quite engaged because they'd sort of had a moment gone, they've got it here, they've got it there. The other, I think, was like, I've got to do this and I've got to do that. And I'm listening, but I'm not understanding. And then there was a tipping point. And for me, I think that was invaluable for us because it was very targeted to people and they've made demonstrable positive changes. Demonstrable. And that cascades down. And I think that was a wake-up call for me because it's too easy to, let's go to the learning development team and let's run this and get this group of leaders at that level to do this. And so
really driving that executive commitment and taking the time out to personalise it, to take them on the journey and get that buy-in, which then we start to see that change roll down. I'm mindful that we've got quite a diverse audience that are joining us this morning. And one of the questions that's come through is actually shifting focus a little bit. Obviously, being in a large corporate, there's allocated resource to help support manage psychosocial risk. But what about for small businesses? Any thoughts or considerations around, small businesses and how they might start to apply psychosocial risk management?
I would say first point is starting with the code of practice, understanding that and turning your mind to what is, reasonably practicable in your context. So, many of us in the room are at the big end of town in much bigger organisations with the luxury of funds, dedicated personnel. I think in that space, education of everybody is key. I agree in terms of the last question that having that executive leadership demonstrated, leaders, so whether that's the mum and dad that's running the small business or the, ASX 100 board that you have, if they're walking the walk and saying we value this, we care about it, it does trickle down to everybody. But I think in a smaller business, sometimes it is people can either feel valued or not valued in a more tangible way because they actually know the owners of the business, whereas, the corporate head office is so far away. And so I think they can actually influence the culture. Is it a speak-up culture? Do they trust you more effectively than you can when you've got a, 5, 10, 20, 30,000 employee workforce? So I think actually having your finger on the pulse with the workforce in that smaller pace, which you can do, is probably the most effective measure I've seen in a smaller business.
Yep. Sean and Nicole, any thoughts?
I think the principles that we've heard this morning, from a number of speakers still apply. I think just keep it really simple. If you're a small business, you can get caught up in, I'm making the product, I've got to sell the product to the customer, I've got to do the books, but just take a few minutes and stop. The principles of what we've heard and what we've learned from some of the previous speakers, I think, just apply them. make 5 minutes, be authentic, live, if you don't have values, live, have values and stand by them. And I think that's, Cilla mentioned, and that rubs off on people and go, okay, I've got clarity, we've got trust. Okay, it's not complicated. Big companies can complicate it, or it is complicated because of the size, and then you've got scale. So I do think the principles, from everything that we've heard from all the speakers, apply to a 2-person show or a 1-person. You can look in the mirror and ask yourself the question.
Are you okay?
Yeah. And look, I think also, it's an opportunity to promote some of the amazing resources that small business actually have available to them. So in New South Wales, Black Dog run, complimentary mental health training funded by New South Wales government. Similarly, there's a program in place for psychosocial risk coaching through SafeWork New South Wales for small business, so 200 FTE or less. WorkSafe Vic is just about to launch a 12-month pilot as well for a similar kind of risk assessment coaching methodology for small business in Victoria as well. So there are a whole bunch of amazing resources out there to tap into for those in small businesses to be able to grow that education and awareness. So we've got about a minute left. So 30 seconds or less, one key takeaway for our audience. What's one thing they can walk away with around psychosocial risk management, moving beyond compliance and into practice?
Mine is whoever your most significant stakeholders are, board, C-suite, whatever, remind them that they have skin in the game, and that what we are seeing everywhere, courts, regulators, is people over profits. And if they bear that in mind, the rest should flow in terms of this, attraction, retention of staff.
Amazing. And I love just the fact that, yes, we're doing this to prevent harm, but there's the flip side. And that's actually a thriving workplace where we can see that ROI.
I mean, mine is collaborative perseverance. And I say that because, we're not going to fix it on our own. And I think so it is collaborative. If we had a budget of $1,000, I'd have to work out the maths, but I'd probably give, $50 to a whole lot of functions like talent, ER, risk, HR, the security team. It's the sum of the parts. So you've got to work together. But I also think, Nicole spoke about some of those examples of well-entrenched. You've just got to persevere. And I think you will get there. And if we've had in a previous organisation, a regulator has knocked on the door, and because we were collaborating and persevering, we had mistakes, but we had a plan and we had evidence we're doing something, and they actually redacted a number of notices because in the end it was like, well, we can't get you on anything. So.
Oh, it's so key. So many times I hear in organisations, well, we don't want to ask because then we'll know and we're worried what we'll find out. And that whole stick my head in the sand is not going to help. Nicole.
So mine would be progress over perfection. No one goes in any discipline from beginner to advanced overnight or in 12 months. So give yourself permission to keep it simple, take it one step at a time, know that this is something that you'll get better at over time as you mature and as the organisation matures and the culture around it all shifts. That's okay. So it's not about being gold standard straight out of the gates.
Amazing. Well, please join me in thanking our esteemed panel.
Thank you so much to our first panel of the day for all of those insights, for what was a really thought-provoking discussion. I think there's a whole bunch of takeaways for those of us in the room, and I saw a lot of people scribbling notes madly, but I think in particular that distinction between being psychologically uncomfortable and being psychologically unsafe is going to be something that stays with a lot of us. Folks, a reminder that if you want to join the conversation, you can do that. You can jump onto LinkedIn, make sure that you're tagging Sonder when you do so, and use the hashtag Sonder Summit so that you get to be part of the conversations as we move on through the day.